Well, I'm Will Overbeck. Thank you for having me. I'm going to present a quick presentation on a research grant that I completed in 2023 titled Physiography, Plant Community Composition, and Floristic Quality Assessment along Ecological Gradients in 5 nature preserves of the Des Plaines River Valley of Illinois. So I had interest in exploring the Des Plaines River Valley because I noticed that there were some southern extraneous species in the lower Des Plaines, and I wanted to see if I could find a pattern of plant biogeography that indicated southern species that were migrating north. So I found the similar plant communities were across the ecoregion, but within the wetland and upland habitats, the prairie, savanna, woodland, and forest communities had some different species, and in those discrete occurrences of specialized species with southern affinities, I'm describing some interesting new ways of thinking about our current plant community composition and what might be developing in the midst of climate change. So I'm using floristic quality assessments, specifically random meander transects, to do a baseline inventory of each site. And then I'm using the floristic quality assessment calculator to quickly do a data analysis and output. I'm looking for the southern extraneous plants, and in 2015, I had found Elamis mcgregori, Clematis pitcheri, and Sedum ternatum at Pilcher Park in Joliet as part of a BioBlitz with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission. And that is what sort of sparked my interest in looking further at what southern species might be inhabiting the lower Des Plaines and whether any are in the upper Des Plaines or whether the boreal influence from the Kettle Moraine topography was more prominent in the northern part. I'm looking at the climatic influences in relation to land use change and degradation and the current fragmentation of the landscape that has affected plant migration and the need for this kind of information to inform us as ecological restoration practitioners during stewardship activities. And this pilot study produced results that contribute to developing further biogeographic studies that I may design and complete. So here's a slide about how you get to know the flora. How do I identify 500 plants and or 1,000 plants in the region? Lots of patient observation, and often with the hand lens or the dissection scope to get to the details of the different hard to identify groups of species. And I'm using mostly the flora of the Chicago region. Here's a quick overview of our regional ecoregions from the US EPA. The level 3 ecoregion is more generalized, and that's just going to call the ecoregion like the Corn Belt or something like that. But when you get a more nuanced approach, you start splitting it up into the Northeastern Morainal Division can be split up into the Kettle Moraine, the lake border moraines, the lake plain, and the Tinley-Valparaiso morainal system. And so when you get there, you start realizing that the landscape has these characteristic aspects of the topography and the soils and the geology and things, and that's what contribute to the plant biodiversity and the why plant migration has occurred in particular regions. Here's an overview of the upper and the lower Des Plaines. The Des Plaines River is the first watershed west of Lake Michigan, and sort of forms the Continental Divide, with the waters from Des Plaines going into the Illinois and the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico, where the waters from the Chicago River go into the Lake Michigan and go to the St. Lawrence Seaway. So it's a sort of interesting split there also. And of course, the Chicago sanitary canal has changed the flow, the watershed a little bit. But originally, this was an interesting divide in the watersheds. Here's an overview of the geology, the superficial geology, and the soils. The river valley itself is filled with quaternary alluvium, which is more recent in origin, with the silt, sand, and gravel that have washed out from the morainal features. And then you'll have different depressions filled with peat, and the morainal ridges composed of sand and gravel. And the slopes, if they're well developed, have more of a silt loam. Here are four of the typical plant communities: the prairie savanna, an open landscape with scattered trees. A forest is a densely canopied woodland with stratified sapling and shrub layers. The flatwoods is an interesting kind of oak savanna with ephemeral ponds and sort of a wetland mosaic complex. And then a typical woodland is going to have scattered oaks with not much of a shrub component, but an open understory that sort of promotes an herbaceous layer. Here's the overall results of the study. From all 5 sites, I found a total of 490 species, 417 native species, and the mean C of the entire flora was 5.15. This is an indicator that I was dealing with relatively intact reference systems, because a mean C of 5 indicates that it has quality. A lot of the species were above 5, and not that many species were that much below it. So we're getting an average right in the 5 range. I'm going to just run through the sites and the statistics. At Capsowers Holding Nature Preserve, I described dry and mesic woodland and dry mesic prairie communities. In the dry mesic woodland, I found 130 native species and 12 non-native. The mean C was 4.42, and the native FQAI was 50.43. Here are some of the conservative species I found, such as purple milkweed, bracted tick trefoil, veiny pea, violet bush clover, and one of the most interesting species at Capsowers is the Savannah blazing star. In the dry mesic prairie, I found 114 species and 18 non-native. The mean C was 4.75, and the native FQAI was 50.76. I found some really significant species in this community, which was a lot like a savanna, of course, which was an opening in the woodland. And it had eared false foxglove, mullen foxglove, Canada hawkweed, the false dandelion, veiny pea, Savannah blazing star, prairie phlox, narrow-leaf mountain mint, prairie dropseed, etc. At Cranberry Slough Nature Preserve, I described 2 plant communities. In the dry mesic woodland, I found 210 native species and 30 non-native species. This is one of the highest species richness I found in my study. The mean C at that site was 4.79 and the native FQAI was 69.35. Indicators of the dry mesic woodland, which had a savanna component on the edges, and that's why it was scoring high, was Asclepias purpurascens, the purple milkweed, and just a lot of other interesting species. The wet mesic prairie had 113 species and 13 non-native species, a mean C of 4.36 and a native FQAI of 46.38. And the wet mesic prairie was a lot like a sedge meadow. It had prairie Indian plantain, white wild indigo, a wild hyacinth, the Carex buxbaumii, brown bog sedge, swamp thistle, great St. John's wort, marsh vetchling, and dense blazing star. At Paw Paw Woods Nature Preserve, I found dry mesic woodland and mesic floodplain forest. In the dry mesic woodland, I found 157 native species and 35 non-native, a mean C of 4.61 and native FQAI of 57.78. And it was a pretty rich woodland, spikenard and poke milkweed, purple milkweed, the long-awned woodgrass, and a lot of other interesting woodland species, especially near the ravine slopes where more light was coming in. In the mesic floodplain forest at the bottom of the hill, near the Des Plaines River, I found 107 native and 21 non-native species, a mean C of 4.55, and a native FQAI of 47.08. And in that community, there were indicators like white baneberry, maidenhair fern, wild ginger, and the pawpaw, which the site's named after, long-awned woodgrass, purple cress, white bear sedge, gray sedge. You can see it's a really rich association there that is, it's a lot like a forest. It's a sort of a swampy kind of forest. At Granger Woods Nature Preserve, I found two communities. The mesic forest had 124 native and 19 non-native species. The mean C was 5.21 and native FQAI was 58.01. And here it was a lot like the floodplain forest we just described, with white baneberry, maidenhair fern, the downy serviceberry, wood anemone, lady fern. Some of the sedges were brome-like sedge, Carex bromoides, Carex woodii, the pretty sedge. And then you get your understory trees like Carpinus caroliniana and things like that. In the northern flatwoods, though, the species richness was 190 with 27 non-native species and a mean C of 4.95, and the native FQI was 68.19, and this is ranking very high in this study. The Flatwoods was a really diverse community that sort of was a transition between the forest and the wet woodland, and a lot of the forest species persisted on the around the buttress roots of the old growth trees. So it was just an interesting mosaic community. I saw the Allegheny serviceberry, the wood anemone, lady fern, the false aster, which would have been in the ephemeral ponds, marsh marigold, spring cress, cardamone douglasii, the purple cress also. You can see it's sort of a combination of the mesic and the wet species, which contributed to the diversity. Wadsworth Prairie, I didn't have time to summarize this because there was 4 communities delineated: the dry mesic savanna, the wet prairie sedge meadow, wet mesic prairie, and the mesic prairie. And basically the dry mesic savanna was sort of like a dry mesic prairie with bur oaks embedded in it along the railroad tracks. and it had 110 native species, 27 exotic, a mean C of 4.45, and a native FQAI of 45.67. The wet prairie sedge meadow was sort of like a marsh, which was it was a deeper community with sweet flag and river bulrush, and then some of the more the wet mesic species like cordgrass. And found 73 native species with 4 exotic species, a mean C of 4.84, and a native FQAI of 41.32. The wet mesic prairie was a little bit drier, 107 native and 9 non-native, mean C of 4.58, and a native FQAI of 47.37. And then the mesic prairie was a small component of this overall site, but there were a few terraces that were of the mesic soils, and the species richness there was 73 native and 20 non-native, with a mean C of 4.29 and a native FQAI of 36.63. Here are some of the species that are southern extraneous that I discovered, and I was not aware of some of these, and then others were sort of predictable. Lycopus rubellus was found in the flatwoods, and I didn't know that it had southern distribution, but it looked it up, and it goes all the way down to Florida, and it doesn't get very much further south than north than northern Illinois. So I found that really interesting. This one was a really interesting discovery. I'm used to seeing it in the Mid-South, and I don't see it in Chicago much. The honeyvine milkweed, Ampelomys albitus. I found it growing around the base of a tree in Paw Paw Woods, and it was only vegetative, so it might have been a recent migration, or it could have been there and just been suppressed by the forest canopy and waiting for a canopy gap. But that was an interesting find, this vine milkweed. And then the coralberry, Symphoricarpus orbiculatus. I found these on the edge of the woods in the prairie at Cranberry Slough. And Wilhelm doesn't really consider this native, but I think that there could be a case made for coralberry being native in the region. And then the Savannah blazing star, which has a curious distribution. It doesn't seem to have an affinity for north or south, but it seems to be more eastern than western, and we're maybe on the western edge of the range. But it's really rare in Chicago region, and Cap Sowers Holding has a really interesting population. And there are a few other sites in that lower Des Plaines area with Savannah blazing star. And then this was an interesting discovery of the Rudbeckia sullivantii. I found this in the Cap Sowers Holding near the entrance where there's a low wet meadow. And this, I think, needs to have further study in the region. A lot of people are not recognizing the original populations of this species, but it's been introduced a lot in restorations. So I think that we ought to look more for the reference systems with this plant and learn a little bit more about its original distribution. And then the final one is zigzag aster Symphyotrichum cranianthoides. I didn't expect to find this, but it was at the Granger Flatwoods, and there was some information about it was a possible introduction, but it seems like it's definitely native in this region. It goes all the way up into Wisconsin, and it sort of settles around the Mississippi Valley. It associates with stream banks and scour zones of wooded wetlands. And that was a good find. There was a large population at Granger. And then I didn't see this one in the lower Des Plaines, but I wanted to mention it. It would be predictable to find it soon because I've seen it down by Starved Rock. The Ruellia strepens, the smooth wild petunia. It's quite common in the Mid-South, but it just doesn't quite make it as far north as Chicago region. So I think that it could be a possible one that'll be migrating north, along with other ones that I'm predicting to migrate north, like purple top, Tridens flavus, and a bunch of other ones like river oats, Chasmanthium latifolium. There's going to be some natives that are going to be moving north, especially with the warmer weather and climate change overall, making it more habitable for these species. So that's it. Thank you. And I'd love to give people my full draft of any of these site summaries or the entire manuscript at the landscape analysis. It's about 120 pages with photos and data. You can email me at ecologylogic@gmail.com, or you can check out my website, www.thenaturelook.com. And I'd be happy to meet you and have a conversation over email. Thanks.